And we're live.
Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. This is Nikki Acosta. You are on Cloud Unfiltered. I'm joined today with my co-host, Ballard.
Hello, everybody.
And we have an awesome guest, author, writer, former corporate employee, but now doing his own thing and keynoting all over the world. It's Joe Weinman.
The best intro I've ever had.
We were going to do a theme song, but we didn't want to get copyright infringement. And he recommended Nine Inch Nails, and that has, some bad words in it.
Right.
Yeah. And then he recommended a Katy Perry tune, which I don't even
to the
know.
Rhythm. It's a philosophically brilliant song. It's all about being independent of the grind and not buying into the vision of utopia. And it's a catchy tune.
Ooh, sounds deep.
That sounds like a theme song you could get behind.
Exactly,
That's
sure.
pretty awesome.
So, Joe, I tried to do my best to introduce you, but do you want to add anything else to your introduction? No?
Nah.
No? Okay, cool. So let's talk about your new book that just came out. Well, it came out a while ago, but it was like at the top of the Amazon charts for a while.
Yeah, so most people know me for Cloudonomics, which is still on good days randomly top 100 in cloud computing, which, most things in cloud computing are all sort of something about the latest release of something like, Adobe Creative Cloud or something, which is lumped up in there. But that's gratifying because all the equations are still correct. And everything I predicted is true. People were making fun of me like 8 years ago when I said that hybrid had advantages. And they were like, Joe, you just don't understand the public cloud. And I said, I think I do. What's wrong with the equations? And then, everyone was like, you idiot. And now it's like all hybrid and flexibility and avoiding lock-in and multi-cloud and so forth. I talked about hyperscale data centers being a little bit overrated because there were sound reasons for dispersion, and everyone said I didn't understand. And then now, of course, the fog is hot. I predicted sustained use pricing. I predicted spot auctions. So that's still good and still very relevant. But, back in the day when I used to speak at various events that are no longer around, I would put up these slides with equations and everyone would be like, oh, cool equations. And then after about 2 seconds, I'd see their eyes start to kind of glaze over and they check their phones. But I was presenting the stuff on cloud-based strategy, and then, their eyes would light back up again. And so that really was the foundation for the new book, Digital Disciplines, which came out a little over a year ago, probably a year and a half ago, and then the Chinese version came out just under a year ago. So I did a lot of day trips to China last year to do big keynotes, and basically that's about how not just the cloud, but big data and analytics and social and mobile and Internet of Things and cognitive and robotics and all of that new technology stuff all fits together to create differentiated business strategies. So that's still relevant. That's the one that was the #1 hot new release on Amazon and computers and technology for a week or two. So that was good.
You've had a pretty wild ride. I mean, just in terms of experience, I remember seeing you at the old, cloud conferences. You were a staple there. But take us back before that. What were you like growing up, and how did you get down this path now to being sort of an author and pseudo-analyst, I'll say?
Are you sure anyone really wants to hear that? I mean,
I do.
Happy to. Oh, you do? Okay. So nothing. Computer science background, Cornell, UW-Madison, executive education at a school called IMD in Lausanne. And then I was at Bell Labs for a long time, AT&T corporate strategy. I left AT&T to go to HP, then left HP to go to Telex. And then somewhere in that period, I wrote Cloudonomics. It was published. There's 2 Chinese translations. For some reason, I don't know why there isn't one, but there are 2 different translations of it. And that then led me to the keynote circuit, 300,000 miles last year in the air. And now I've been doing less keynoting and more writing for various clients, which is actually, I'm happy to stay home. People are like, where do you like to go, on vacation? I'm like, when you travel every day, the best vacation is in your backyard with a glass of wine. So that's
Yeah.
it.
So tell us about this book, Digital Disciplines. Like, who is it written for? Why should they read it? And what are some of the insights that they would get from it?
So, when Cloudonomics, to help explain that, I'll give you a little bit of background into Cloudonomics. I was writing this book called Cloudonomics, and most people have seen the original GigaOM piece where I came up with the term, and it was called the 10 Laws of Cloudonomics, and it was like these cleverly worded things like, you can save money even if you pay more, and then, that was like, huh? And then the explanation has to do with unit cost versus total cost and elasticity under variable demand. And so I was writing all these things about cost optimization and in some cases about performance optimization. So for example, if you're using the cloud for geodispersion, for latency reduction, if you double the number of nodes that you have, what does that mean for your latency? And that's true whether you're an enterprise that's doing a build out or if you're, let's say, an Akamai or a CloudFront or what have you. So I worked out all that stuff, and it was basically almost done with the book. And then I'm like, one day I wake up because like you're deeply entrenched in the book, like digging up references and making sure that your commas are right and things like that. And I just woke up one day and I was like, oh my God, I just wrote this whole book, and it's not quite about something I don't believe, but it's missing a very large point, which is that the cloud is not just about cost reduction. And if you think about that way, then you're completely missing the boat. And the reason is, if you figure that IT expenditures on average are 4% of revenues, and let's say you're a great CIO and you do all this clever stuff with cloud migration and hybrid and cloud bursting and multi-cloud, and you manage to save 25% of your IT budget, you're only operating at a 1% level relative to revenues, which is good, right? 1% is better than 0%, but it's not compelling. But conversely, if you're, let's say, Netflix, and you create tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap and drive your competitors out of business because you're leveraging a cloud-based strategy, then that's really important. So Cloudonomics, like chapter 4 or 5, is about cloud-based strategies. And once you start down that path, I try and be intellectually rigorous with these things. And so like one question begets another question. So if you say, well, is the cloud strategic? You have to say, well, what do you mean by cloud and what do you mean by strategy? And so even saying like, what is strategic, then there's different formulations of corporate strategy and competitive strategy. And they're different because one is about portfolio optimization. The other is about sort of a product optimization and differentiation, and then what's a product versus a service, and the 4 Ps models, and the Kepner-Trigo driving forces, and Michael Porter 5 forces model, all of that stuff, right? So anyway, I settled in on a model that is called the value disciplines model, which simply put is just about better processes, better products, or better customer relationships. And these guys, Michael Tracy and Fred Versa, over 20 years ago, coined the phrases operational excellence and product leadership and customer intimacy that we all use today, but not necessarily giving them credit. And I really like their model. And
theirs was the value model?
Value disciplines, right.
Okay,
and they have a famous Harvard Business Review article from the early 90s called Customer Intimacy and Other Value Disciplines. They wrote a best-selling book that's been translated into, I don't know, dozens of languages called The Discipline of Market Leaders. Multiple Chinese, Cantonese, Shanghainese, Mandarin, etc. It was very insightful. It's very clear. It's easy to remember, which is really important because, maybe there's a better model, but if you need a PhD in rocket science to understand or apply it, that limits its broad applicability. And so it's a great model, but remember back then, cell phones were something that you mounted in your car and were too heavy to hold, right? And, the internet was barely alive. It was HTML 1.0, pre-CSS, right? Pre-dynamic HTML.
GeoCities.
Exactly, right. GeoCities, AOL, Lycos, all that stuff, right? So they sort of anticipated the relevance of IT. So they talk about what GE did in terms of creating virtual inventory through a mainframe-based system. and that kind of thing. But the point is, it wasn't really leveraging modern technologies. And the other big point is that it isn't just that you can say, oh yeah, it's the same basic strategy, and all it changes is you put the word digital in front of it, or internet, or right? Because everything
Yeah.
changes. And just to give you an example, you know, obviously having a better product is one way to achieve competitive advantage. But what did that mean for, you know, the past 5,000 years? It meant better materials, like you used gold, you know, rather than bronze, rather than, you know, stone. It meant, you know, maybe finer aesthetics, like a clever, you know, they had all those script logos. Brand has been important, you know, for a long time, and so forth. But now, when you think about what makes a leading edge product, it's got to be smart, digital, and more importantly, connected. And when you say it's got to be connected to the cloud, and from there on to partner ecosystems and peer-to-peer environments and customer co-creation and over-the-air upgrades and things like that, you're really not just saying, okay, it's you know, it used to be a better product, now it's a better, smart, digital, connected product, because everything changes because of that. So as an example, I'm going to take Nike as of a year and a half ago, where I thought they really, you know, had a strategy that exhibited all my points very well. And so consider Nike 5 years ago or 10 years ago. You make sneakers, okay?
Right.
And, you know, that's very nice. And you make some, you know, athletic shirts and, you know, shorts and things like that. And you get celebrity endorsements. And that's, you know, maybe one of the keys is product innovation, like Nike Air, the original waffle sole, and so forth. Another part of it is marketing innovation, like celebrity endorsements. But at the end of the day, you're selling sneakers through a third party, like, let's say, you know, Sports Authority. They were around at the time. And a customer walks in and they say to the person, hey, you know, I'm a runner, and, you know, my, you know, knee's been hurting. What do you recommend? And the salesperson kind of says, well, you could try these Nikes, you could try these Adidas, you know, you could try these, and so on and so forth. And it's like, okay, great. And the person buys a Puma, the manufacturer never knows. Maybe even the retailer doesn't know, you know, that, because unless there's loyalty cards. But that's the end of it, right? As an apparel manufacturer, you were intermediated by a retailer to an anonymous customer, and the only way you have any insight into your customer demographics and needs is maybe, you know, you have a focus group, you station someone outside the door, whatever. Now, though, if you're selling sneakers, first of all, that have, like, you know, accelerometers in them, motion sensors, they're tied through a Nike Plus iPod or various Xbox coaching applications and so forth, the customer of your product is no longer anonymous. Okay, secondly, you're collecting all of this historical data on workouts and paces and routes run. You're tying it into their social network. You can offer personalized coaching services. You have a high degree of customer value add, and there's a model called the experience economy that says that there's a hierarchy from commodities to products to services to experiences and ultimately transformations. And a transformation, like a university education, like brain surgery, or like becoming a better athlete through coaching services, is the highest value and it's the highest profit. Then you add in the stickiness, because you have years of historical data. You enable these connected digital products to open up an ecosystem of partners through a developer API and SDK and cloud-based services for all this historical data. And it's not just that you have a better product the way that the Nike Air was better than the original, you know, Nike sneaker or athletic shoe. It's that you've completely transformed the relationship with the customer. And if you think about things like pay-as-you-drive insurance or Solar City, you know, we'll buy and pay for the solar cells on your roof, and a chargeback model based on remote metering over the internet, you know, or American Family Insurance that gives you a premium discount with Nest Protect smoke detectors. All of these products now enable new business models and new stickiness. And of course, it isn't just products, because you also have services like connected healthcare. We're using a Proteus pill or gait monitors or things like that to provide continuous healthcare as a connected service rather than a connected product. You can develop a 360-degree view of the customer. For example, GE Healthcare has something called DoseWatch, where what they do is individual pieces of radiological equipment like X-ray machines and CT scanners are all good as far as they go, and they do their job and they're calibrated to give a safe dose. But if you just left the doctor's office, you go to the hospital, and the doctor sent you for a diagnostic, but you're slipping in and out of consciousness, and the X-ray does a CT scan, and then they do an X-ray, and then they do this, and then they do an MRI, and then you can get an unsafe dose by the aggregation of all of these safe doses. So unless you have all this equipment sort of linked to something, it's not something that you can, we'll send in the form and it'll be processed a month later. It's got to be done in real time. That gives you a 360-degree view of the customer. So,
Wow.
those are some examples of the basic idea of one way to compete is through better products or services hasn't changed. And by the way, these guys, Tracy and Versa MA, they're great writers. I only wish I could write half as well as them. And their only flaw was that, they were, brilliant, but they were brilliant in 1993.
Back then.
So I updated the book. Once you start thinking about this stuff, you're like, oh my God, what GE has done, with what Bill Rue will say, who I know from one of the cloud events that I think Nikki and I were at a long time ago, Cloud Connect Silicon Valley, which is probably 4 or 5 years ago. Bill Rue, talks about GE's digital transformation and the industrial internet. But I've spoken to him over the years multiple times, and one of his key themes is the ability to focus not just on product sales, right? Like if you're a business, usually it's, what's the funnel? How are we doing this month, this quarter, this year? Same period last year, same store sales, those kind of metrics. But now, because you are connected, and thanks to the Internet of Things in the cloud, you can focus not just on your own internal view, but on customer outcomes. So things like Power by the Hour, where GE doesn't just sell you an engine for whatever it is, $5 million, and say, good luck with that, hope it works okay. Fill out our annual customer satisfaction survey. Now they've got 20 sensors in each engine, collecting 5,000 data points per second per sensor that are locally compressed, but then uploaded for analytics. And the IoT over the cloud leads to better predictive analytics, leads to predictive maintenance, leads to optimal maintenance, where you can say, look, we know that this engine is going to start to, have a high risk of failure in another 100 hours of flying, rather than, maintaining it, or having to fix it when it fails, in some airport where you don't even have maintenance facilities, just fly it over to one of your main, maintenance center depots, and then you can fix it with your own certified staff and, your parts, and minimize systemic outages, as well as, maximize engine time and the airplane's flying time. You can use these things the same way that Netflix does personalized movie recommendations. You can do personalized airline recommendations, where you can have airlines adopt best practices from each other, or best practices that are relevant to their own operation strategies, like single engine taxiing to conserve fuel while you're kind of, in line. Like I fly in and out of Newark all the time, and it's, from when you leave the gate to when you're actually in the air is 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes as a rule. So if you can conserve fuel while you're doing that, that's very helpful, obviously. So the point is, everything changes when you take the cloud as the center, and then you factor in all these other things, like cognitive, and now quantum, and IoT, and fog, and edge computing, and you transform architectures to not have everything central, but you can do data compression or distributed query. I'm also I guess one of the things I should have mentioned, I'm the cloud economics editor for IEEE Cloud Computing magazine. I end up writing about 2/3 of the articles, but we're always looking for submissions. So I just did one on the hybrid multi-cloud fog, which is, my new mantra, because, hybrids of private and public are provably optimal. For most customers, there are reasons to use just private or reasons to use just public, obviously. But for many enterprise customers, a hybrid strategy makes sense. A multi-cloud strategy makes sense, and by that I don't just mean randomly using multiple clouds, but using them in some sort of integrated fashion, whether it's supporting a single workflow or enabling some degree of data integration between the various cloud service providers. And then this mix of, let me call it a appropriate balance of hyperscale, more centralized consolidated cloud with more distributed fog, edge, dispersed computing, achieves the right benefits in terms of data compression, backhaul, network cost reduction and traffic reduction, response time for either users or things, right? Like if you think about autonomous vehicles. So there's lots of different, benefits, and you can look at these things from a qualitative angle, from a quantitative angle, or from a strategic differentiation angle. And between Cloudonomics and digital disciplines, I think I've covered kind of all of those, although obviously technology marches forward. So we just did a piece on microservices that Adam Ivey from Disney did a really nifty analysis that showed that microservices is obviously great and fits with today's architectural methodologies and container strategies and things like that. But the challenge is that when you start doing enterprise scale, like for a Disney, you have so many hits per second that what sounds like a great, free offer through free tiers and per hit pricing and gigabit or gigabyte second pricing turns out to actually be economically disadvantageous versus like, an old style, dedicated server running in your closet, or even just a VM running in, a pre-microservices cloud. So there's all kinds of cool things to look for.
So when somebody's hitting all the services all at once, then it's too much and the economics don't make sense. It's better to have an old school system set up rather than
exactly. So that'll be out like any day. So you can just Google Adam Ivey, EIVY for Disney, or many of your listeners are probably IEEE Computer Society members, so they get IEEE Cloud Computing magazine for free. And that'll be in the latest issue.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Especially, I mean, I know serverless and being billed per transaction is a hot topic nowadays, right? With that, and so it sounds like that's something for enterprises to really take a hard look at when they're looking to go down that path.
Yeah, so I mean, I love the strategy, and I think ultimately, I mean, I have to tell you, the one thing that I really detest about cloud is usability. Okay, like, what made Lotus 123 transform reality was ease of use, right? It wasn't that you needed a PhD in economics to use Lotus, anybody could do it.
Right.
And, things about, come on, IP addresses, seriously, it's like, it's 2017 and we're still worried about managing, IP addresses. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me. So, it should be as easy as email. And actually, I don't know whatever happened to this, but Microsoft had a cool thing that they were working on. It was called Excel Datascope or something like that. And the whole idea was that if you wanted to manipulate small data sets, you did it in Excel on your laptop or smartphone even. And if you wanted to manipulate enormous data sets, you could do it via Excel on your laptop, right? So it was completely transparent. The fact that you had 1 trillion records sitting in the cloud didn't mean you needed to be a cloud expert. It just meant that you kind of the same way that you might, just type into Outlook the fact that, here's your mail server, and it, from there on, everything is transparent. You don't know, like most people have no idea. They're like, well, wait, is this thing running on my laptop or running in the cloud? And how do I know? And if I deleted something, is it like gone for good, or can I get it? Right. So in the same way, like that Datascope, I think it is, lets you manipulate large data sets, in the cloud transparently. And obviously people are using, data visualization tools, but, Excel, there must be 1 billion people or more in the world that, can use Excel with their eyes closed.
Yeah.
So that whole model of making everything easy to use, I think ultimately with microservices, that's it. Like, okay, I get programming, right? I learned programming before most people on this call were even born. And I can do it. Okay, even I can do it. But it should just be transparent, right? It should be, I want to say, A equals B plus C, and the fact that, B is an enormous, trillion record, columnar record, or column, that's, I don't care. It's just A equals B plus C. Like it should be the same, or colon equals, or whatever it may be. It should just be easy to use. And I think that once the economics of microservices get past sort of entry-level pricing, we start seeing price wars there too, then they'll actually be economic. And then you start just get into, performance optimization issues. But again, even there, the point is that if you have, let's say, 100 millisecond minimum runtime for a hit, then it doesn't make sense to tune up your application below that. That was one of, Adam's insights in the piece. And so it was like, man, we spent weeks trying to tune this application, and it turns out, if it's running on your own resources, under a classic strategy, then of course it matters, because if the application runs in 50 milliseconds rather than 100 milliseconds, then it's half as expensive. But if you have 100 millisecond minimum for a microservice transaction, then it doesn't matter if it runs in a millisecond or 100 milliseconds or a microsecond or a picosecond. It's still going to cost you exactly the same. So, right, and then obviously you get into, that whole interrupt-driven type of, or event-driven architecture. And, obviously if you're latency sensitive, even if the time from the trigger to the execution is really quick, it may not be as quick as, leading things through some sort of message queue into a running application. So obviously there's some performance optimization issues, but I think that's the right architecture, for the long term, especially once, cloud becomes as easy as, email
Excel
or messaging, where, when my 9-year-old can do it, then I'll know we've arrived.
So in terms of this data collection that's happening, I was on a really interesting panel last week at the OpenStack Summit. I tweeted out the link today, but I had Thomas Cameron from Red Hat, I had Rafi Kodalian from Cisco, and I had Al Sadowski from 451. And we were talking about sort of this this notion that in exchange for having these sort of more intuitive experiences, you're also giving up a lot of privacy. And I don't think that we have fully grasped what our futures will look like when large companies have a bunch of data. People are going to know if we, work out because we have, our connected shoe or whatever, or they're going to know what our buying habits are because, they're able to see inside of our refrigerators. What is that balance of, more intuitive experiences versus privacy?
Well, ultimately what it comes down to is companies are going to carve out, like they already have to some extent, at least allegedly, that as a differentiator, right? So, if you have a choice between, let's say, a free app that does X, but they may use your data, versus one that you pay for, it's like the difference between, free, but you've got to listen to ads, versus pay for and the ads are cut, right? And so that's a choice. So some people will say, hey, if somebody wants to know what's inside my refrigerator, let them have at it, right? And someone else might say, wait, if my insurance premium is going to go up because I've got a lot of sugary foods that, are proven, to raise cholesterol and lead to obesity and heart disease. And, I don't, I'd rather pay the $5 for the, certified secure refrigerator, grocery store reordering app than, save the $5 there, but pay, $10,000 more a year in healthcare.
Or just put everything in aluminum foil in your fridge, right? So they can't tell.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Do you think consumers are hip to this though? Like everyday consumers?
No, but I think that there are, the third parties that have their own economy based on exposés like this, right? Whether it's New York Times, Consumer Reports, CNN, right? News at 11, what your refrigerator may be telling, your health insurer. So, there should theoretically be, I'm not saying there are now, but one can hope that it's a mix of consumer choice coupled with kind of some companies that are more ethical and make it their business to be ethical, just like, no GMOs, it's no peeking inside your refrigerator. And I think that there's a market for that where, right now, all these things are ad supported. But people do pay for a higher degree of, performance, whether it's security or timeliness or what have you. So, you pay extra for a safety deposit box, at a bank that presumably has video surveillance than you do for, a locker at the train station. And that's why.
I think about that a lot. I heard a story on NPR after the recent Google hack, and they were talking about, services that are already connected to your Google accounts. And so immediately I pulled open my app and I was like, I still have unroll.me installed. Great. And look, unroll.me was a great service for me because, I subscribe to a lot of things that I don't necessarily need to see individual emails for. I'm just bombarded by email. But I started to think about that. I'm like, okay, well, who else has access to my Gmail account? TripIt's in there, for all my trips. I mean, what else do these people have access to? I mean, presumably someone could get a pretty darn good feel of my purchase habits, things that I'm interested in, my, political or religious affiliations.
Yeah, I reviewed all your stuff because I had access to your Gmail account, but it's something that's just like there's only so much time in the day, and like whatever, I started to get the pattern. So,
would people pay for Facebook if they knew that their information wasn't being shared? If they knew that they didn't have to see ads, you think people would pay for it?
Well, I think you're already seeing that, some companies have better behavior, right? So Facebook is kind of realizing, with the whole, the links that lead to either viruses, other malware, or if nothing else, they're just, a way of serving ads, but don't have any content. I have a patent, I have 22 patents that have been issued actually, but one of them, or two of them.
That's all, Joe? Just 22? Just 22 patents, that's all?
Yeah, only so far. But a couple of them are basically on looking at, it was a better search algorithm based on, instead of just the PageRank algorithm and those kinds of relevancy-based returns based on a recursive analysis of links, that you could actually look at traffic without doing deep packet inspection to better understand if someone was clicking away fairly rapidly. And you can either do it in the network or you can do that on the edge, which actually when you click on a Google result, you're actually not taken straight to the URL. You're first taken to Google, so it knows which one of the links you clicked on, and then ultimately.
Yeah, and I remember when that changed too, because I remember I was like, why is it so much slower now? I remember that.
But again, it's, I don't think Google is doing anything unethical with it. It helps the algorithm, right? If they know that when these 5 links are presented, humans are smart enough to ignore these 4 that are just random garbage, and, they always know this one, then that helps tune the algorithm. But in addition, what would be really useful to know is if you clicked on something, you were like, oh, geez, I can't believe I just did that. This is, nonsense. Then that should be worked in too. So it's the whole time at the destination, not just the initial choice that's relevant. So it's one of those things where technology can be used for good or bad, right? It's like clean electric power or nuclear war, and well, is it good or is it bad? It's both. And in the same way, these kinds of things for some demographics going to be, this is great. I'm not a billionaire, and like every penny counts, and so I don't want to pay $30 a month for a Facebook type of service. So whatever, like I'll look at ads, I don't mind, and they're kind of interesting sometimes. And an ad in itself is not bad or good, right? If it's very relevant, it's good. If it's irrelevant, it's a waste of time. And obviously if it's malware, it's bad. So, the kinds of things that let companies tune these things can be good. Obviously if, I'm so old, I'm one of the few people that still watches like the nightly news, which has it's basically a nonstop pharmaceutical commercial interspersed with bits of news that I got on Google News 24 hours earlier.
Yeah.
But whatever.
Because you need a more comfortable catheter. Let's be honest.
Exactly. Yes. So
those commercials are horrific. I see them too, and I'm starting to see them more and more.
Yeah, well,
as I click around, and I'm like,
I know it's like it was pharmaceutical, Trivago guy, pharmaceutical, Trivago guy, and now after 5 years just having that same guy, now they have the Australian woman, so it's pharmaceutical, Trivago woman, pharmaceutical. But whatever, it's a choice that I make, and if I don't like it, I should do something else with my time. So
what are the implications of humans being bombarded with this much data? Like, do you think our brains have evolved to be able to handle the amount of input that we're getting on a daily basis?
I know mine hasn't, and there's some studies out of Stanford that says that multitasking is a myth. People think that they're good multitaskers, and then and they say, oh yeah, no, I can do that. I can listen to music while I'm doing work, while I've got the TV running, and I get it all. And then you ask a simple question like, okay, well, was somebody murdered? What? Or what happened with this plot twist? I don't know. I missed that one thing. So I think through the existing mechanisms, there's limitations. I think as you maybe deal with direct brain interface technology, there will be some improvements because you're no longer limited by the interface bandwidth, but still you have limits to attention. So unless there's some pharmacological mechanism for changing our brains, we're kind of limited by what we can do now. It doesn't matter whether my eyes are open or closed. I can only, I couldn't have this conversation if I was trying to watch TV. I'm like very much of a single tasker. And the robots are going to take over sooner or later anyway, so we don't have too much longer to have to worry about being bombarded by ads.
And then you won't have to be at your mom's house helping her move because robots will do it for you.
Well, that's a very benign view. Yes, hopefully you're right.
If someone could invent something that would move you, man, I would pay for that for sure.
True.
Even moving companies is still old school,
Oh yeah, true.
So Joe, one thing we were talking about just before the show, and we didn't get too deep in it because I wanted you to save it, but one thing that's been getting a lot of attention just in tech circles is this notion of net neutrality and what the future of net neutrality is going to look like, given some of the announcements made by Ajit Pai. And you said that there are pros and cons, but what are those pros and cons in your mind as far as net neutrality goes, and what is your stance on it?
So, overbooking, people are irritated, obviously by the recent incidents, and I think it's pretty clear that dragging someone off a plane and nearly killing them is probably not a good idea, either from an ethical perspective or from a customer messaging perspective. So people are like, well, we should stop overbooking. Okay, but there's an example of where you make a trade-off, and that trade-off is, tickets would be more expensive and you'd have less flexibility, right? It's like, concert tickets, for example. They don't overbook, concert seats. But the issue there is that if you don't go, you better find someone to buy your tickets, or else you're out the money, right? You can't just, it's not you got to have a $20 change fee for concert tickets, or a $200 change fee. So in the same way, so overbooking has its advantages statistically, because it gives you, like, the 10% of people that change their minds, flexibility. But you're obviously playing a statistics game, and whenever you have something that's outside of 1 or 2 standard deviations, maybe, then you end up with challenges, right? With bumping people from flights, or needing to buy tickets, and obviously mathematically you're doing that economic optimum. So it's the same thing with net neutrality in the following sense. If you're an over-the-top player, then you'd love to be able to continue making fat profits, right? Basically printing money like the leading over-the-top players do, and kind of let somebody else invest, the tens of billions of dollars in capital investment in network infrastructure, so that you can keep printing money. So yes, it's great from that perspective if you're over-the-top player. It's great if you're a consumer that wants to be able to benefit from free services and so forth. If you're watching Netflix, obviously you want, not just 20 megabits per second to the house, but 20 gigabits per second to the house, so that, the whole family can watch in, HD 4K or soon 8K. So that's all great. But if you're the person that is investing in that infrastructure and trying to, make a return that is, just somewhere, nominally, marginally above, like, Christmas club accounts at the bank, then, you want to be able to, make a fair risk-adjusted return on your investment. And I think therein lies the rub. So, like I said, there's pros and cons. It depends on, where you are in the ecosystem, and are you making money or losing money. I would say that I have, very little illusion that, most, if not all, of the companies in the space are all profit-seeking, growth-seeking enterprises. And so, rather than listening to some appeal because we love the consumer so much, it's more a follow the money type of thing. And, not to, there's nothing wrong with making money. That's what drives innovation. And if people didn't make money, we wouldn't be in this Google Hangout right now. So that's all, it's all good. But, that's really what it comes down to is, who makes the profit? It's not anything else.
What about browser histories? As far as, companies being able to, like they have it before, capture your browsing history data and sell it to other people?
Yeah, well, that again is something that was already happening, right? It's just a matter of now the players that were already able to monetize it don't want other people to enter the market and monetize it. So, obviously I, as a consumer, don't want anybody, I don't care if they're an over-the-top player, a network service provider, a foreign entity, or anybody looking at my browser history, or I don't want them rifling through my drawers. I don't want them in my living room. I don't want them, stopping my car on the road and, throwing an ad in the window. I just, obviously, most people like some degree of privacy. And so, but again, I think it comes down to, for every technology that says that we can look at browsing history, there's technology to sell a browser, or offer a browser that has incognito mode. For every, open internet that is potentially eavesdroppable, there's, encryption and Tor. So, it's a war of technologies. And I guess what it comes down to is the consumer/enterprise customer just needs to be wary. And there's momentary advantage, like with Unroll Me, where it was like nobody knew, and then the news came out, and then there goes that business. And so there's also ephemeral business models that, that they dry up, and just this constantly evolving ecosystem.
Do you think that enterprises are, if you had to give enterprises a grade on how they're doing in terms of, adoption of or building out of things like, artificial intelligence or, advanced algorithms to make decisions around the business, what grade would you give, your typical, let's say, Fortune 1000 customer? How is the industry doing as a whole?
Look, I talk to lots of CIOs, and I go to lots of events with CIOs and IT VPs and directors of IT and so forth. And, I would say that they're uniformly have, great heads on their shoulders, but we're also dealing with very complicated technological challenges, a lot of evolution, and also, there's a well-known problem just in staff, right? So if you're a super sharp, take whatever you consider to be the best school, MIT, Tsinghua, Stanford, Caltech, whatever. If you just graduated, summa cum laude from one of those schools, you're either going to go, private equity, McKinsey, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, right? And so the challenge is, if you're the typical, Fortune 137 company, whoever that is, I'm sure somebody can look it up, but it's, Bob's, North American Steel, Continental Can, pick your favorite airline, et cetera. The first thing is, how do you envision the possible? And there's some great work from Dick Foster from when he was at McKinsey, that some people are familiar with, but may not know that it was him and a colleague that did it, around the notion that markets are much better at dealing with discontinuities than enterprises, right? So they know the Christensen stuff. They might know some of the incumbents' curse stuff around risk aversion, cannibalizing existing product lines, et cetera. But markets typically are better at, generating innovation, right? So if you're Yellow Cab, you're thinking, how do I get my tires at a better rate? You're not thinking, let me create something called Uber, which is partly a lack of vision, partly a lack of traditional focus and kind of the IT skill levels of, let's say, typical senior executives of these companies. And so it's up to, it's classic Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift stuff around, it's either outsiders or young people that create new paradigms. And today, obviously, with the cloud, the ability to innovate, between, app stores and AWS and or its competitors, literally not any, but, even a 12-year-old can innovate. So there's this super cool guy, Tanmay Bakshi, who I've seen at IBM Interconnect now twice. He's 12 years old. He's an amazing keynote speaker, does live demos, and he's like, oh yeah, here's what I'm doing, with, the IBM Watson API, and I created this new service just this morning that does this and that, and you're just like, oh my God. So the ability, you're just unleashing innovation as never before, but, everybody is not Tanmay Bakshi. And so the whole thing is that, that's the issue, I think, is first, how do you envision what's possible? Secondly, how do you deal with, a classic Clayton Christensen type of disruptive innovation, incumbent's dilemma? He calls it the innovator's dilemma, but it's really the incumbent that has the dilemma. And so, how do you deal with that? And then even if you can deal with that and you say, you know what, we'll cannibalize existing product lines, we'll create a skunk works, or, we'll work with partners, we'll do a JV, arm's length, whatever it may be, how do you staff it? And I think, those are all the challenges. And then when you get into some simple things, like in Cloudonomics, I talk about, well, just look at the unit cost of your own, enterprise data center versus running the similar services with that architecture in the public cloud. So that is easy to say, but hard to do, because and here's the analogy. If you want to know how much a hamburger costs at McDonald's, you drive there or look it up on the web, and you look at the menu, and it's like hamburger $1. So it's pretty easy. You know that the unit cost of a hamburger at McDonald's is $1. How much does a hamburger cost in your own house? Well, the cost of the beef you can figure out, per quarter pound, but how do you allocate the cost of the kitchen? And if you use this frying pan to make 7 different dishes, how frequently do you make hamburgers? And therefore, how do you allocate, the cost for the hamburger versus that of making pancakes? And by the way, you use your home office to pay the electric bill, which goes to the lights so you can see what you're doing. So, right? So it's the exact analogy if you're an enterprise data center. How do you figure out how much a transaction costs in your own data center? Well, what's the overhead cost? SG&A for the enterprise, how much gets allocated? What about the salary and bonus of the CIO? Well, what about the team that's working on operations, but this is just one of the applications that they're worried about? And by the way, 7 of them are on a new DevOps initiative. And you know what I mean? So envisioning something completely innovative is really hard, okay? And again, it's markets with disruptors and global innovation are probably a better way to do that. Once you envision it, actually executing in every dimension is hard. And then, by the way, if you thought you were kind of understanding, hardware as a service, then VMs come along. And then you thought you were understanding that, and then containers come along, and part of your team goes here, but then microservices come along. But then AWS introduces this new service, but then Microsoft has cloud functions and they do that, but is it better or worse, and what's the cost than what the comparable Google function is? And then with IBM, I can run OpenWhisk, and maybe I can do that in private or public. But so you know what I mean? So doing anything intelligently and optimally takes information, which is constantly changing and which takes money to gather. And you kick off an initiative, and by the time that initiative reports to you and you revise that and you report to the board, there's already been 5 new generations of technology. So it's not easy. So you've got very smart, very well-meaning professional people that are just it's a challenge being in this industry today.
How do you keep up, Joe? How do you stay up to date on things? What sources?
I try and listen to Cisco podcasts.
Shameless plug. By the way, this is available on iTunes, and please subscribe.
Great answer.
Yeah, so it's really, I'm more of, I either get my information through reading, and Google News is the source of everything, or through conferences. So one of the advantages of being a frequent keynoter is I'm a frequent attendee. And I like listening to what smart people are doing, and then I meet them when something is intriguing. So for example, I was talking about this Adam Ivy article. I accosted him. He was probably ready to call the cops on me in Shanghai at Cloud Connect China. I was like, oh my God, this is great. Would you do a piece? And he was like, get away from me before I call security. I was like, no, seriously, I'm not a crackpot. So that's good, too, is things like IEEE cloud computing. There's, some lesser known academics and some pretty well-known people like David Linthicum that write for it frequently. And but it's hard. There's an infinite amount of information, and there's only so much time in the day. So, it just seems like it's getting harder and harder, which goes back to my theme about why usability is so important, right? If nobody had to go to a 6-week, $10,000 training class to figure out how to use their first iPod, right? And that's the key, right? Is you just make things easy and usable, and then anybody can do it. And that's ultimately a mechanism for adoption and crossing the chasm.
I was at the OpenSec Summit last week, and it just happened to be attached to a mall, and there just happened to be a Barnes and Noble's there. And I was kind of meandering through Barnes and Noble, but one of the end caps was completely devoted to X phone for seniors, like how to use an iPhone for seniors, how to use a Samsung Edge for seniors, how to use an XYZ device, how to use a computer. And it was amazing to me the cultural divide, how much has happened, and you can see it. I mean, you can see it between, my generation and my mom's generation and my grandfather's generation. Like the older you are,
ebooks available for download on how to use an iPhone?
No, they were physical books and magazines that I saw.
Now, when you use the term physical books, what are you referring to exactly? Sorry, just kidding.
Those things with pages,
Oh,
meanwhile, I was there to like keep one of these grocery list things and to-do lists. I needed like actual dedicated, notepads. This company makes these great, like, hey, here's the things that you should do, keep track of it. And they put it in nice
very clever.
Mouse pad format, because
that's called digital physical fusion.
I need it.
Paper that uses a mouse pad.
I wish there was a calendar that I could have on my desk and I could just write on it and it would just feed to the cloud and sync with all my devices, like in my own handwriting. Wouldn't that be cool?
Well, your Nest cams have already been hacked into, so the one that is where your calendar is in view actually is already in the cloud.
Oh, great.
So don't you actually have an appointment coming up? I can't really see. I have a window open on your calendar.
What a scary future we're living in. My goodness. Oh, and great too. I think a lot. You have a 9-year-old. I have an almost 7-year-old. And I think a lot about just the path of education and how outdated it is. We used to have to memorize things. I remember telling my programming teacher, who was also my geometry teacher, I'm like, why do we have to learn this stuff? Like, can't computers just do this already? And he's like, it's not a matter of the content, it's a matter of using your brain. And I thought, that's interesting. So you're telling me I should do this because it's good brain exercise. Looking back at those times, it's pretty amazing to kind of see that education, how desperately behind it's fallen. My kid is asking Siri for anything. Siri, how do you spell blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, man.
Well, it's true. And, talking about education, like my daughter would spend all her time in Minecraft if it were possible.
Yes.
And so, which is not really a big issue. I used to play with wood blocks when I was a kid. So she plays with, virtual blocks and wood and many other substances, right? But if they could just figure out a way to deliver like history and multiplication tables and learning how to do division and stuff instead of these like enormous like 80-pound workbooks. I'm surprised she doesn't have like back problems from carrying her backpack. I can barely lift it. So if they just put it into Minecraft, then
then we'd be good. It would solve world hunger.
Everyone would have a PhD in astrophysics. As long as it were just a world in Minecraft or Roblox.
You're a tech guy and I'm a tech gal, and I'll tell you what, my kid loves his video games. He loves them. And I hear all the time, oh, you should limit their time, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking about it and I'm like, man, on one hand, I feel like I should. On the other hand, I interview a lot of podcast guests who were that kid. So, it's always a struggle, but we do the best we can do, right?
Exactly.
Well, Joe, we are about out of time. I think somewhere along the last few minutes we lost Val, but that's okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
I think.
Where are you going to be coming up? You're working on a new book?
Yes.
Yes. Can you tell us anything about that?
On innovation.
On innovation.
Where can people find you? Secrets to innovation, and where some prior people have good arguments, but they're not quite right. So I figured out where they're wrong and what to do. And it's funny how one thing leads to another, like Cloudonomics. One chapter in there led to the new book, Digital Disciplines and Digital Disciplines. I was looking at innovation as a strategy, and specifically cloud-mediated innovation, like innovation networks and idea markets and online contests and challenges like Folded or the Netflix Prize. And so I did a couple of chapters on innovation, and kind of as I thought about it more and more, I realized that I think there's some valuable insights that I have. So I just gotta find a few free minutes, much less months, to actually bring it to a close. So
well, I'm looking forward to it, most definitely. I got a copy of your autographed Cloudonomics many, many, many years ago, and I still have it. So
someday that'll be worth a lot. Like if it's a cold day and you need to start a fire
to stay warm.
Exactly.
When our electric grid gets hacked and it's freezing cold outside, and the only source of warmth you have is the books in your home.
Exactly. Well, actually, I just watched Day After Tomorrow last night. I watched part of it, and that's what they do. They're in like the New York Public Library.
Yeah, I remember
The world
that.
freezes, yeah. So, but speaking of which, I know you've got to wrap up, but am I the only person that thinks that Kindle was partly named for book burning?
Ooh, good one.
I thought that was like, I don't know, not to start another conspiracy, but that was my original thought, for what it's worth, when I, heard the name of it.
Well, I do know that there are some deep meanings behind some of the project names in OpenStack, and I won't say what they are because I've covered that in other podcasts, like with John Dickinson of Rackspace, if you want to go back through the old podcast archives. But
so
yeah,
what's one of the project names that you can't mention?
Swift, where they got the name for Swift. And there's a handful of people at Rackspace that knew where the product name for Swift came from. And when I found out what it was, I was like, oh, interesting.
Uh-huh.
So you may have to go on a wild goose hunt because I'm not going to say it here. Or you can stick around after and I'll tell you.
All right. I'll see. All right. Well,
follow Joe. It's
That was fun.
J-O on Twitter. JoeWeinman.
JoeWeinman.
E before I.
Wine, kind of spelled the German way rather than the English way, and man.
Awesome.
All right.
And with that, I will toast you a glass of wine tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, Joe.
Oh, you don't have to toast me. Feel free to just express mail the bottle.
I'll think about you when I burn books for warmth. How about that?
All right, fair enough.
I hope you can come back sometime soon, Joe. Thanks
All
for
right,
joining. Those of you who are here, SoundCloud, we're on YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe. Please leave a comment, leave a message. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, farewell. Goodbye.
Farewell.